My name is Susan Mack. I am a writer and a storyteller. I produce Austin's Stories on the Lawn, true personal storytelling show. Next one is September 11th. And one of my favorite things in life, one of my favorite things to write about, are weird and unexpected things. I search for them. I sometimes can't avoid seeing them. But one of those things would be much better if I had a clicker in my hand. Thank you. So, one of the things in the past year I found to get fascinated about is Galileo's middle finger. Why? Because my husband and I were in Florence in the Galileo Science Museum, walking around looking at telescopes and ancient scientific instruments, and there in the middle of the Science Museum was this finger in a chalice next to a bunch of early thermoscopes. And I thought, what is this? It is Galileo's actual middle finger from his right hand. And if you're like me, and you see this, you will have questions. I had questions like, why would people save a finger? What is important about it being Galileo's finger in particular? And does it matter that it was the middle finger? Right? So, I started researching. First of all, I'm going to say this was not the first time I had seen a finger displayed ornately. The first time I saw one was actually in Siena nearby, and it was St. Catherine's finger. There are other famous fingers as well. John the Baptist's finger is in Kansas City, Kansas. Who'd have thought? And St. Thomas is in Santa Croce in Rome, and I found some handy-dandy pictures of these other fingers, also displayed in gilded containers. And you don't only find fingers. These are all, it's important to note, these are all in Catholic churches. You don't only find fingers in Catholic churches. You find hands and heads and bodies and all kinds of things. It turns out that collecting all these things is not unique to Catholicism. Collecting relics and venerating relics probably goes back as far as you can find it in human history. We can think of Egypt in particular with mummies and the pyramids, and Mickey was kind enough to inform me that actually in Egyptian religion, Osiris was blown up into pieces, and there were temples in all the body parts of Osiris, I believe is what Mickey informed me on. So this is a thing that has been done for a long time, but because we're talking about Galileo, I looked in the history particularly of Catholic relics. And the definition of a relic in Catholicism is an item that is connected to a martyr or a saint. And there are different orders of relics. But a first order relic is the body part of a saint or a martyr. And the first time we can record a veneration of body parts of a saint was in the 2nd century AD. There's writing about someone dying and about his bones after being burned being as valuable as gemstones. And in 787 AD, it was decreed that every single Catholic church would have a first order relic, which is a body part of a saint, somewhere in the cathedral. So even in the Austin Catholic churches, somewhere in the altar, there is a spot where there is probably some body part of a saint stored there. Now, I did not grow up Catholic, so I found this completely fascinating. But why? Why do we have these body parts? It is because they're supposed to remind churchgoers of the sacrifices that were given because that's how important God is. So it is not supposed to be that we venerate the body parts or the saints, but they're supposed to help us remember our religion. Now, this becomes very interesting when we specifically talk about Galileo, because his middle finger is not in a Catholic church, it is in a science museum. And when Galileo died, he was under suspicion of heresy. So he was not only not a saint, but he was buried in a heretic's grave. So that makes this a very interesting relic for something that was taken in the 17th century. So let's talk about how this happened. Now, who was Galileo? Galileo is considered the father of modern science. And he was really a measurement guy. He made a lot of very, very interesting innovations of measurement that I could spend all of my nerd night talking about. I will go and look at this list. But probably for this talk, the most important thing to understand is his innovations in astronomy. He made the best telescope anyone had ever made that gave 30x magnification. And because he made this optical innovation, he could then turn it to the stars. And he began observing things that no one had ever observed. The moons of Jupiter, that the phases of Venus matched the phases of the moon, distant stars. And he began noticing things like supernovas and believing that supernovas were an indication that maybe the universe was growing. And that all of this data that he was observing and collecting with his telescope matched Copernicus's theories. So he began taking measurements that were more consistent with a view of the world called heliocentrism, which means that the Earth rotates and the Earth rotates around the sun rather than all the planets and the sun rotating around the Earth. Well, there's a problem with that. It creates a conflict with the church, because the church's view was that geocentrism was described in the Bible, and that earth and heavens were immutable, that God had created them and they stopped, and that creation stopped and they did not continue to change from there. And that the church itself owned all truth. Now, Galileo, he began talking about heliocentrism, that the sun is part of the Milky Way galaxy, that the universe is growing, and that the church and science are really asking different questions, so there's really no conflict between them. They can share truth without it needing to be a conflict. Well, then we get to 1615. And Father Niccolo Larini, a priest who really didn't like science very much, brought Galileo in front of the Roman Inquisition for the first time on charges of heresy. And the big problem was that he was saying that Galileo was reinterpreting the Bible. And at this point, the church was about 100 years into the Protestant Reformation. They were still fighting wars between Catholics and Protestants, and the last thing they wanted was some kind of Protestant revolution in Italy near the heart of Rome. So they were saying that Galileo was looking a little too much like Protestantism, and he needed to stop teaching heliocentrism. And Galileo said, okay, I'll stop. I don't believe in heliocentrism. And if you think that this sounds like chickening out, I should tell you that if he got charged with heresy by saying he believed in heliocentrism, that was punishable by death. 15 years before this, the poet Niccolo Bruni in Rome had written poems positing that there was life on other planets, and he was publicly burned, and not only burned alive, but they put an iron mask on him while he was being burned because they didn't want people to be influenced by what he had to say. So the stakes for Galileo in stating publicly that he believed in heliocentrism were death. So he says, no heliocentrism, and they say, okay, fine. Galileo stays quiet on heliocentrism. But then in 1623, there's a new pope. This pope has been a friend of Galileo's, he's been a supporter of Galileo's, and he says, you know what? I want you to explore the arguments between heliocentrism and geocentrism. The Pope goes to the Roman Inquisition, gets permission for Galileo to explore this, and Galileo begins working on a book. The book, Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems. So when Galileo writes this book, publishes this book, he has two characters, one representing geocentrism and one representing heliocentrism. He names them after Greek philosophers. But the one who was representing geocentrism was named after Simplicius, whose name translated into Italian at the time as simpleton. So it was taken by the public reading this book because also these arguments came out a little bit bumbling and didn't quite match the science as well as the heliocentric view. And basically, everyone said Galileo's making the Pope look like an idiot. And the Pope didn't like that very much. The church didn't like that very much. So we end up in 1633 with the famous heresy trial, where Galileo is again brought in front of the Inquisition. Again, he says, I don't actually believe in heliocentrism. I didn't mean to insult the Pope. This was all inadvertent. And so he was found vehemently suspect of heresy, which is one step down. It's like, okay, we're not going to have felony manslaughter, or, murder, felony murder. It's maybe manslaughter. So, and it turns out that they actually could have put him through a full torture inquisition, but because to ask him about his personal views, to see if his belief in heliocentrism was really there or not. But at this point, Galileo was old, he was blind, and they ended up saying, okay, you're just going to go to prison. And so he served one day in prison and then spent the rest of his life under house arrest. And they banned not just the dialogue, but all past writings and all future writings. No one in Italy was allowed to publish anything by Galileo. And that's how he spent the last years of his life. So he does publish one more book. He writes one more book. It gets smuggled out of Italy and is published in the Netherlands. And this actually becomes one of the most foundational books in modern science, which we'll get to in a minute. But in 1642, when Galileo dies, his family is afraid to bury him publicly. He gets put in an unmarked heretic's grave, which is what usually only happens to people who've been completely excommunicated from the church. But then, what happens? Well, in 1648, there's an important treaty of Westphalia, which ends the Protestant wars, and basically the Catholics and Protestants decide that they can live together and share Europe. This starts maybe taking some of the power of the church down a little bit, and they don't have to fight science quite as much. But in 1687, Newton publishes the laws of gravity, and he cites Galileo's work as one of the two most foundational parts of his understanding of the laws of physics that we use today. Galileo is becoming increasingly respected as a scientist, and it becomes clear that Galileo is he wasn't actually killed for his belief in science, but he's just one step back from being a martyr for science. And one of the things that happens that's really important is that Galileo's students and followers don't like the fact that he is buried with dishonor, so they start collecting money to rebury him. Yeah. So 1737, Galileo is buried in this beautiful tomb in Santa Croce in Florence. In this same cathedral, you have Machiavelli and Michelangelo and all of these famous thinkers, and Galileo is now respected. He's buried as respected, even though it would still be more than 100 years before the church would stop their bans on his publication, and he would not get an apology from the church for being wrongly tortured and harassed until 1992. But he got reburied, and when he was reburied, Antonio Gori, who was a priest who was setting up a museum. He was an antiquarian, and he liked to collect objects. And he collected Galileo's finger when Galileo was reburied and started displaying it in a museum in Florence. So that is how we have this secular relic from someone who was somewhat a martyr of science. But I've not answered the final question here. Does it matter that it was the middle finger, right? Were they giving Galileo the chance to say what he really thought to science deniers over the ages? Well, like I said, I had to research. I found out the first recorded incidence of the middle finger being used as a rude gesture was in 419 BC in a Greek play. The ancient Romans referred to it as the indecent finger because it was being used for rude gestures. And, okay, I only went to Wikipedia, but there's some evidence that this gesture came to the US in the mid-1800s from Italian immigrants. So, wow, okay, so the middle finger was being used as a rude gesture, quite possibly back in the time of Galileo, except Gori didn't only take the middle finger. He took Galileo's full set of writing fingers from his right hand, and it just so happens that the thumb and index finger went into private collections, and we have lost track of where they are. They've disappeared to time. So there's really little support from it being intentional, but I'm still going to say I think it was maybe fate. And I like to believe that for whatever reason, Galileo gets to express his opinions to science deniers for the centuries. And so now here we are for Q&A.
Oh, that was really great. Thank you. All right, who has the first question for Susan? All right.
Thank you. I have visited Galileo's finger in Florence, and one of my questions to the guards, which I will repeat to you now, is it pointed at Rome? Do you think so?
I'd like to know what the guards said.
The guard laughed. It was the laugh of somebody who might have heard this joke before.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you for the talk. That was great. If you could take a body part from a personal hero of yours, whose body would you take it from, and what part would you take?
So I want to say Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And I'm going to go for her gavel hand.
Why is the finger placed in a chalice?
I don't know the exact answer to that, but when I look at all of the other fingers, if you go back, it is common that other saints, so relics in general inside of Catholic churches, and I want to stick to like the Catholic tradition because I believe that that would be what was influencing where things were placed at the time that this finger was taken. There are two ways that they're stored. Sometimes they're stored inside of an altar where you can't see them, and other times they're stored in reliquaries. And reliquaries tend to be very, very ornate and beautiful in order to give respect for the person whose body part is being revered. Because often the body parts that are displayed publicly are for maybe higher oriented, more well-known saints who did big things. So I think, I don't know this because I haven't researched that question, but I would think that it was because of the honor that people had to Galileo when they were taking the fingers.
Okay. where's that hand?
Hello, thank you so much for your talk. My question was, how do they preserve these relics? I guess not just this one, but in general. Like if someone's hand is there some way that they make it not look terrible?
So again, I'm going to say I'm not an expert in the answer to that question, but I would assume that we have a long history of, formaldehyde and treating corpses, and that these would be treated with some kind of preservation in the same way. But if you look at that finger, I mean, it's really just the bone that's left. So.
They're basically desiccated.
Yeah.
Right? Just, yeah. All right, any other questions? Yes.
How much of the finger was there? I mean, did that go just down to the knuckle?
So
or-
if you look, it's got the fingernail, first knuckle, second knuckle down. It looks like it goes all the way down to the wrist. So yeah, it's down here. But I mean, again, this was taken off his body 90 years after he died. So I think it had had plenty of time to be desiccated, and what wasn't going to be preservable to be gone before they took it.
Okay, great. Thank you so
right,
much,
thank
Susan.
you.
Fantastic.